ASTI classifies agricultural research expenditures following three different categories: salaries, operating and program expenditures, and finally capital investments. Under salaries, we clearly include the wages, the salaries of agricultural researchers and technical support staff, but also any other staff remuneration packages of permanent or temporary staff, including things like health insurance or pensions or any other benefits. They should all be included under salaries. It's also important that you include the labor cost of those scientists that are not on the official payroll, that perhaps have a consultancy contract within a certain agriculture R&D agencies. Those costs should really also be reported under salaries and not under operating costs. And the next section, operating and program expenditures. Those are all the costs associated with running agricultural research programs to keep laboratories operating, etc. So this includes items such as electricity, gasoline, agricultural inputs, staff training, travel, maintenance, and any other cost associated with running research programs. And finally, capital expenditures. Well, capital expenditures include all investments related to the purchase or rental of items that last longer than a year. So things like buildings, laboratory equipment, cars, computers, office furniture, etc. Well, ASTI aims to collect information on the actual expenditures made by an agricultural R&D agency. We don't collect budgeted or projected expenditure information. It's also important to include all funding sources. So don't only report the cost categories, so salaries, operating costs, or capital investments that are funded by the government, but any other funding sources should be reported as well, including donors or income that's generated internally through the sale of goods and services. ASTI does not collect any financial information from universities, and we're actually looking into ways of getting a better sense of the expenditures of universities. But so far, ASTI has not collected any information on financial information from universities, because it's very difficult for universities to provide this information simply because of their mandate. Like typically, a university might, for example, spend 80% of its time on teaching and 20% of its time on research. And the problem is, like, if we start collecting information just on research projects, the universities tend to under-report on any other items. So what ASTI has done up to date is just estimate university expenditures by assuming that average expenditures per researchers at universities is roughly the same as average expenditures per researcher in the government sector. If there's very good reason to assume that average expenditures per researcher in the university sector is significantly higher or lower than in the government sector, ASTI makes adjustments. ASTI collects detailed time series data on the breakdown of agricultural research funding at the agency level from all government agencies and non-profit agencies involved in agricultural research in a particular country. First of all, government core allocations. Under government core allocations is included all the direct institutional funding coming from a central budget. So for example, if you are the National Agricultural Research Institute and you fall under the Ministry of Agriculture, that all the funding that you all the government funding that you receive from that ministry should be reported under government core allocation. Under other government funding, we want you to report any other kind of government funding, so other than the core funding that the Institute receives. And this could be any funding, for example, if you are placed under the Ministry of Agriculture, so any funding that you receive from any other ministry, like the Ministry of Science and Technology, for example, or any government funding that is channeled through competitive funds, for example. Those could all be reported under other government funding. Then ASTI makes a distinction between loans and grants from multilateral donors. First of all, loans, obviously, as the name implies, is money that you need to pay back to the donor. These loans include loans from the World Bank, from the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank, and they should be reported under a separate item. Then we move on to the grants for multilateral and bilateral donors. And under this type of funding, we include any bilateral funding coming from a country to another country, so funding from France to Côte d'Ivoire or from the United States to Kenya. But we also include things like grants from CGIAR centers, for example, or sub-regional organizations or regional agricultural research organizations such as FARA or APARI, or any other private foundations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundations. The next item is commodity levies and producer organizations. These include funding through commodity taxes levied on agricultural production or exports. Not all countries have this type of funding mechanism, but we see this in particular at institutes that are involved in agricultural research in certain export commodities, such as, for example, the Tea Research Institute in Kenya or in Tanzania. Much of their research is funded through a government-imposed levy on tea production, and then a part of that levy is then channeled to research through the government. And next is the sale of goods and services. So we want you to report any internally generated resources through the sale of seeds, the sale of publications, on-demand research for the private sector. And then finally, there's just the other category, and other just means any type of funding that cannot be classified under any of the other categories that we identified above can be reported under the other category. One of the challenges you might occur when collecting data from agricultural research agencies is that the financial reporting systems of agencies do not always reflect the same classifications as those used by ASTI. So ASTI wants you to report data by government, donors, internally generated resources or commodity levies or any other funding sources. But perhaps a particular agency's financial reporting system has completely different classifications. So it might not always be easy to follow the ASTI classifications, but when in doubt, you can just send the information to us by email. One other challenge that you might come across is that financial years do not necessarily match calendar years. So for example, if a financial year starts on March 1st and runs until the 28th of February, there is a challenge here. But we can assume that, for example, if the financial year starts on March 1st, that means that 9 months of the calendar year occur in one financial year, and 3 months of the next calendar year still occur in the same financial year. We assume that most of these months, so 9 months, can be reported under that calendar year in which most of the months actually are placed.